Welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, the podcast that helps aircraft owners and aviation businesses learn and understand the complex world of aviation insurance and risk management. From the basic principles of aviation insurance to risk management techniques and updates on the aviation insurance market, the Aviation Insurance Podcast is your guide to traverse the world of aviation insurance. Now, here's your host, Tim Bonnell.
All right. Well, welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, where we've been journeying through the kind of fundamentals of aviation insurance. And we spent a while looking at the aircraft insurance policy from an overview, general level. And so we've been spending the most recent episodes in the aviation commercial general liability policy, or the aviation CGL policy that's carried by most aviation businesses. And a lot of these coverages are actually present on a number of broad form aircraft policies, particularly for turbine and corporate type of aircraft. So with that, we've been talking about the policy structure each time of really any insurance policy in general, but certainly under the aircraft and aviation CGL form. And it's that acronym DICE, the declarations page that lays out the specific terms of the policy at a high level, and then and defines some things. And then we get into the insuring agreements, which we reviewed, which spells out the certain things that the insurance will cover. And there are some exclusions in the insuring agreements. And then we talked about the conditions, those things the insurance company and insured must do in order for coverage to be in effect for the policy to apply. So as we talked about then, we find exclusions all throughout the policy, including an exclusion section. So in this episode, and perhaps one to follow here because there's a number, we want to talk about the exclusions of the aviation CGL policy. And then that will lead into a discussion about some of the endorsements we can purchase in order to address these or other policies that may be in order to address these exclusions and exposures. So first, the unendorsed aviation CGL policy does not cover air shows, air meets, contests, exhibitions. That is an exclusion to pretty much every aviation CGL policy. There is a chance if it's a very benign or small event, the aviation CGL policy would consider endorsing that particular event to the policy. But in most cases, there will need to be a separate policy because under the unendorsed policy, air shows, air meets, contests, exhibitions, any of those things are excluded under the aviation CGL policy. Fortunately, there are markets or programs that specifically insure air shows, and we can get to that at another time. The standard aviation CGL policy excludes restaurants owned or operated by the insured. And when we're dealing with aviation operations or fixed base operators, we will find some restaurants operating in or by named insureds. And so that is something that needs to be addressed. Skydiving, parachute activities of any kind are excluded under the aviation CGL policy. That's pretty much a non-negotiable, as well as the standard ones we talk about in about every single policy: noise, pollution, asbestos, mold, electrical interference. So if the different radio waves get in and disrupt something that leads to an occurrence or a loss, that's not covered. Pollution, noise, excluded. Pollution, we can talk about buying back part of it somewhere else on a different policy. We've talked about in the aircraft policy at length that war risk and allied perils are excluded under pretty much every policy. It's the same thing in aviation aircraft as is aviation CGL. We have a separate episode on that. So go back and look up our episode on war risk and allied perils coverage, because war, confiscations, losses due to riots, malicious acts, seizure pretty much by anybody of the aircraft, that is not covered under the unendorsed aircraft or in terms of the CGL, the aviation CGL policy. So separate episode on that. War risk and nuclear is excluded. You can buy back some of them, as we talked about in that particular episode, except for nuclear-related coverages. That we can't buy the coverage for that ever. One interesting exclusion that you will find today, it used to be called the Y2K exclusion, is now called the date recognition clause. Those of you who are old enough will remember that there was a concern that all computer systems would shut down and airplanes would fall to the sky, and all these issues would happen when the computer systems went from 11:59 of December 31st of 1999 to January 1st of 2000 because they weren't programmed to handle the millennium. So anyway, you'll see a date recognition clause that has been updated to kind of reflect any future issue related to that type of exposure. Here's another great exclusion. Intentional acts are going to be excluded. Anything you do, you walk up and punch somebody, that's not an insurance coverage that you're going to find under your policy. The policy excludes the serving of alcohol. Now, really, what it goes on to say is if you're in the business of, so if you make money from selling or distributing alcohol and for maybe a charter operator or an FBO, that could be a factor. We may need to look at adding some sort of a liquor liability. Again, there's an exclusion. So it may need an endorsement. Now, that said, if someone does not typically furnish, sell, or provide alcohol on a regular basis, let's say they have a company party in the hangar, many policies have that's either not excluded or you can find what's kind of called a host liquor endorsement. We'll talk about that in another episode, but that's excluded. Being in the business of selling, distributing alcohol, that's excluded under the aviation CGL policy without an endorsement. Everything related to workers' compensation, so the actual injury to an employee, is excluded. Workers' compensation in every state is the sole remedy for issues related to employees' injuries. Employees are covered under the negligence portion, typically, of the CGL for the work they do, but injuries to the employees is excluded. Anything related to employment practices, your hiring practices, termination practices, unfair practices within employment, that's excluded. Again, a separate policy. Employee injuries, excluded. Air traffic control operations are excluded under the aviation CGL policy. So if someone's got control tower operations or even doing much on a Unicom, that probably should be addressed. Any owned or operated auto, aircraft, boats, generally excluded. The transportation of mobile equipment. So transporting a fuel truck or a tug or golf cart, once it's on a trailer or an automobile, it's excluded from the aviation CGL. Many policies will include mobile equipment when it's not being transported while it's on the insured premises, but once it goes onto a trailer, it becomes an automobile. It becomes part of the automobile exposure, the automobile policy, so it's excluded under the aviation CGL. So again, the exclusion leads to coverage being necessary somewhere else or is better insured somewhere else. Property owned by the insured or in the insured's care, custody, or control. That's excluded unless otherwise endorsed. So if it's owned by the insured and or in the insured's care, custody, control, it's excluded. That's why we talked about hangar keepers. And that's why there's other coverages and other policies that are in place. There's also exclusion for the maintenance shops out there and other people who do longer term products called, basically an exclusion for damage to the insured's product and work. And I know if somebody's done a 3 to 6 month maintenance or avionics project and the insured's negligence damage the aircraft, let's say burns it down, there's going to be a significant investment loss. And so there's an exclusion for that the insurance agent would need to address. Any type of loss of use, withdrawal of the product, or recall related to the product defect is excluded. The aviation CGL, the product's completed operations liability, it's not a warranty. And any loss has to be related to an occurrence, a sudden accidental event, or a repeated exposure to that related type of event is what an occurrence is. So that has to be necessary for a loss to respond. Any kind of defect, withdrawal, loss of use is not covered under this policy. They also exclude non-aviation activities under most aviation CGLs. So, guys, that actually is quite a few exclusions. There's more. Again, exclusions happen other than just in the exclusion section of the policy. So you've got to read the entire policy, but those are a few that I like to highlight when discussing this and wanted to bring to your attention. We'll come back and talk about some of the endorsements. Obviously, aviation CGL is a very big policy, and in the aviation world, there are some differences in definitions and exclusions, and so we can't obviously cover everything. So this just gives you an overview of things to look for and listen to and where you could probably find them. So keep that in mind as you review your aviation CGL policy or the aviation or the general liability type coverages under your aircraft policy, should you be fortunate to have those. So that's everything we have for this week. Join us again next time as we continue navigating the waypoints of aviation insurance and the aviation CGL policy. And till then, enjoy clear skies and unlimited visibility.
Thanks for listening to the Aviation Insurance Podcast. If you found this episode of value, please share it with someone who would benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player so you don't miss any new episodes, and to help our show have more impact. This episode is brought to you by Aeris Insurance Solutions, your flight plan for navigating the turbulence of aviation insurance. For more information, visit aerosinsurance.com. That is www.aerisinsurance.com. Disclaimer: these episodes are for educational purposes only, and due to the changing regulatory and legal nature of the business, some information may change over time. Having a well-educated and experienced aviation insurance broker on your team is an absolute requirement to success in business and for managing your aircraft and aviation business risks.